Our top business story, the International Monetary Fund is warning South Africa that it needs to pick up the pace of economic reforms. Let's get all the details from Simon Marks, who's in Washington. Simon, despite President Cyril Ramaphosa's moves, meetings and promises to turn things around, the IMF says South Africa's economic recovery plan faces serious constraints.
Yes, it does, Shahan. That's literally how they couch it in this two-page report compiled by IMF staff who visited South Africa on a mission to assess the situation there. And they say at the beginning of this that they did have hope after the political transition from President Zuma to President Ramaphosa that there would be improved governance in the country and enhanced cooperation between the private sector and government. However, the report goes on to say that some of that initial optimism has dissipated as growth remains stuck in low gear and government's reform implementation has faced constraints. This, the report writes, is a critical time to implement stalled reforms to restore confidence, attract investment, support growth and rebuild buffers to deal with the challenging environment that the country faces. And the IMF concedes that part of that environment is due to the global conditions in which the South African economy finds itself. Nonetheless, there are very clear warnings in this report that unless the government changes its approach to economic reform implementation, then there are dangers lurking around the corner for the South African economy.
So it's somewhat official, some would say. Ramaphosa has died down and isn't really working all that well, especially because of our embattled and poorly managed SOEs.
Yes, and the report goes straight to the heart of the situation relating to the SOEs and specifically to Eskom. It says, with growth continuing to lag, economic vulnerabilities are rising. Growth will be insufficient to make a meaningful dent in poverty and inequality. And it talks of the fragile financial positions of several state-owned enterprises, including Eskom, particularly Eskom, it says. Weak growth and deteriorating public finances could trigger additional capital outflows, creating adverse spillovers through the interconnected financial system. And the report is essentially calling for a much more robust approach to those state-owned enterprises and to sorting things out specifically at Eskom as part and parcel of moves that the IMF argues the government needs to take to bolster support in the and confidence in the economy.
Now, the IMF says South Africa can turn things around by doing 4 things. Take us through them.
Yeah, absolutely. There are 4 specific recommendations in this report, Shahan, addressing the remaining governance issues that the country is facing and improving the business models of state-owned enterprises like Eskom. The IMF seems to see those 2 things going hand in hand. You can't improve the situation for state-owned enterprises if you've still got corruption pockmarking the government sector and the governance system. Revisiting labour market practices to create more jobs, promoting competition in all sectors of the economy to boost opportunities, and then, and perhaps most controversially, reducing uncertainty by clarifying the government's approach to and position on the issue of land reform. The IMF in this report says that land reform should focus on enhancing agricultural productivity and strengthening tenure security. There's no specific mention in this report of the concept of expropriation of land without compensation, but reading between the lines, the IMF does not seem to be an enormous fan of that, and it says that the negative effects of the conversation on land reform should be mitigated, particularly those related to the security of property rights. So that gives you a sense of where the IMF is coming from, not just economically, but also politically. It is warning that unless that issue of land reform is somehow confronted and overcome, and that the sting is taken out of it, there is a possibility that populist politicians in South Africa, doesn't mention the EFF by name, but it clearly means the EFF, has the potential to capitalise on the uncertainty that the land reform debate is creating.
There's also talk about the mining charter, which has been up for debate in South Africa in the past couple of years. Take us through that.
Yes, so on the issue of the mining charter, the report is arguing that public debt is reaching uncomfortable levels, fiscal policy needs to be gradually tightened, and the impact of public infrastructure investment on growth should be enhanced by improving project selection and implementation capacity within the budgetary framework. So throughout this report, on a variety of issues, including the issue pertaining to the mining sector, the IMF is arguing for a much more classically liberal economic approach to life, an approach to life that traditionally, of course, the IMF favours, because it is an enormous supporter of free market capitalism, of public and private economic partnerships in economies around the world, and in that regard, the IMF is not departing from its classic ideological line in this report.
All right, thanks so much for that. Appreciate it. Our correspondent Simon Marks in Washington.